Today I'm going to introduce you to soldering. We have 4 rules. No, there's 5 rules. There are 5 rules. I kind of like you to remember all of them. There's only 4 levels of solder, but there are 5 rules to soldering. Okay? So the first one is fit. You have to make sure that your metal is in absolute contact with the thing that it wants to be a joint with. So if you have a flat piece of metal, you got to make sure it's really flat. And then you attach it to another flat piece of metal that you've made sure is very flat, so that when they're together, there's no gaps the way there are with my fingers, because they're not flat, okay? Any gap will just stop the capillary action flow of that solder, and it's pretty specific. Very small amounts of solder are flowing in that gap. So at any point it rises up because it's not flat, it'll kind of go around that joint, or it'll just stop altogether. So you got to make sure it's fit. And you can do that by annealing. And then after you get everything actually fitting to one another, you got to make sure it's clean. So each of those joints need to be clean. So you can do that with sandpaper. You can do it with a file. You can do it with pickle. And we can talk about pickle later. We have the pickle at school, which is that lovely, nasty stuff. Cleans it just beautiful. And after you get it absolutely clean, you're going to want to keep it absolutely clean. So you go to number 3. That's where flux comes in. Flux is a layer of glass that covers the joint so that when heat is coming in and creating a chemical reaction essentially with your metal molecules, the heat starts to break them up and they shake up and they start grabbing for the oxygen in the air, and that makes for a Swiss cheese solder joint. So you want to put flux on the joint, and additionally you want to put that flux on the solder as well. So you also want to make sure that that solder is clean because it's part of the joint, right? So now we're over here on solder. Rule number 4. There's 4 kinds. You'll need to use all 4 to make something complex, you know. But if you're just doing something simple, you might just pick one of them. For the most part, I tend to use a lot of hard. You want to make sure that you have a little piece of sandpaper in with your pieces of solder. You can kind of clean it up before you clip it. Once you've clipped it, it's really hard to sand it, so I tend to keep it in the larger chunk and then clip and try to use all of it. If I don't need to use all of it, I'll leave it in there, but I'll try to use it within a day so that it doesn't oxidize. Put the flux on top of your solder as well. Then you apply heat. Now the heat is kind of very particular. The solder tends to follow heat, but the solder isn't following the heat of your flame, it's following the heat of the metal underneath. So your goal is to evenly heat that metal so that solder flows along it. And it'll follow that flame if that flame is properly creating that heat and draw. So you can get used to moving around your piece to get the whole thing up to temperature. And then you will use that flame as a draw to pull that solder along that clean joint. Now, things that'll make solder not work are, obviously, there's a gap, no fit. There's a really dirty spot and it won't go over it, so it'll just stop in its tracks. You forgot to put flux on it, so it just all got dirty really quick. No solder. Well, that's a hard one to forget. But the heat, how you're using the heat. And sometimes that's going to take a little bit of practice, but eventually you'll get the hang of it. Think of your heat as like an overall oven experience, creating the heat and rising it up and then drawing your solder along a joint. That's about it on the rules, but try to think of them before you sit down and you're setting up. Go fit, clean, flux, solder, heat. Fit, clean, flux, solder, heat. Can't go wrong. If you just get that in your head as a mnemonic, you'll be very successful. Hi there, I thought I would show you a little bit about capillary action by creating a tiny puddle here. Just a little puddle of water. Oh, it's not in the frame. That's awesome. There's my puddle of water. Oh, okay, so I got a puddle of water. Now I have a representative of a gap coming towards my puddle of water, just to get the impression. Now you'll notice that this has a gap right here. Let's see if it follows it in that direction. And you'll see that it is actually sucking up that water a little bit, as far as it can go. And it stopped right there. Let's see, if I pick it up, you can see where it went and where it stopped, but where it jumped over here. So where this gap was, nothing was there, but it continued right around this side. So that's kind of the goal of solder, trying to create a space where that water gets drawn around a place where something fits. I thought this might maybe be a good visual.